As part of the new scoring rubric for the AP English Language and Composition exam, 4 out of the given points are allotted for evidence and commentary. So this video will talk exactly about that. Now, my goal is to talk about how the points are distributed and how to earn the maximum amount of points for this category. As you probably already know, for the thesis, you can get 1 point. For the sophistication, you can get another point. But for the category of evidence and commentary, you can get up to 4 points. Now, the focus of this video will be explaining what each of the points, what it means, and an example of each one, so that you understand what a 1 looks like, what a 2 looks like, and so on. Now, what I plan to do is to give you examples of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and these are all body paragraphs written by my students. Sometimes I've altered them to make them look worse or to make them look better so that they can fit the score a little bit better. Now, what I'll do first is begin with the example of a 1, and then I'll take you to the example of a 4 so that you can see in stark contrast to this one what a 4 looks like. Okay, here we go. Throughout the essay, there is a constant juxtaposition on the way athletes and nerds are treated. In line 18, Friedman wrote, "Nerds are ostracized while athletes are idolized." This is one of the many examples throughout the passage of a comparison between the two groups. In line 20, Friedman wrote, quote, "Children who prefer to read books rather than yada 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 yada." This is an example of nerdy behavior and typical athlete behavior that Friedman uses to highlight just how poorly nerds are treated. Okay, why does it get a 1? Well, clearly the problem here is there is an observation in the first sentence, which is barely a claim, but let's call it a claim. Then there is a quotation in the second sentence. Then the third sentence is not an analysis. It's not a commentary. It's nothing really. It's just, I guess, a summary of the quotes. See, nerds are ostracized where athletes are idolized, right? This is one of the many examples throughout the passage of a comparison between the two groups. This writer has accomplished nothing, further nothing. And then he does it again. Here's another quote. Here's another restatement of the same thing. Now, this is an example of a 1 primarily because it summarizes the text with little to no commentary. So if we go back here, you can see a 1 is earned when the evidence is mostly general and the commentary summarizes evidence, but does not explain how the evidence supports the student's argument, right? This is an example of a 1. I'm going to gloss over a 2 and a 3, and I'm going to go directly to a 4 so that you can see how different, obviously, it is and why one deserves 1 score and the other, right, in contrast, is a big difference. And then we'll go back to the 2 and the 3. Kelly paints a picture of poor little girls slaving away to elicit empathy from her audience. She repeatedly says that while we sleep, little girls will be hard at work at mills, making an ironic contrast between sleeping adults and working children, when the roles should be reversed. While we sleep also implies the ignorance of the audience by indicating that adults that have been turning a blind eye toward labor policies in order to create guilt among her audience. When she says, quote, "A little girl on her 13th birthday could start away from home 5:30 in the afternoon carrying her pail of midnight luncheon as happier people could working in the mill from 6 at night until 6 in the morning. She creates a scene of a sad little girl walking to work to evoke empathy, as most of the women in her audience can see themselves or their daughters as this little girl. The use of this image, compounded with that of several thousand little girls working in textile mills and the deafening noise of the spindles and the looms spinning and weaving cotton wool, creates a pathetic pantheon of lawfully enslaved children that not only appeals to her predominantly female audience's conscience, but also creates a maternal desire to protect the girls as their own." Wow. Okay. This is clearly an example of a 4, and I do have to say that it is very difficult to score in isolation, meaning to award up to 4 points for one body paragraph is a very difficult thing to do, and sometimes not correct. But if we imagine that this body paragraph, that there's another one like it, right, and there's an introduction that has a thesis, we can assume that this body paragraph definitely would get a 4 in terms of the commentary. Now, if we go back here, you can see what I mean. The evidence is specific, supports the claims, the commentary is consistent, and it explains the evidence and explains how multiple rhetorical choices in the passage contribute to the writer's argument. Going back to the 4, you have the imagery, right, of the little girls working, the appeal to pathos, trying to make the audience feel guilty for turning the blind eye to what's happening here. It's very, very very distilled analysis. So this is why this is an example of a 4. Now, when we go to a 2 and a 3, right? A 2, if you want to think of it, a 2 is only a little bit better than a 1. And a 3 is not as good as a 4. Think of it like that. Now, here's the example of the 2, and here's the example of the 3. I want to start with the example of the 3 since we just did the 4, so you can see it as contrast. It is obvious throughout the essay that the author favors beauty as the aim of art, such as clear by the language describing the moralists as uncultivated, intolerable, and unreasonable. The writer's compromise will be appealing to both sides because the author, while firm in his view, is not interested in changing said views, but finding a compromise between the morality and the beauty. The author finds this compromise by comparing museums to libraries and nude statues. The author establishes that the analogy helps us to decide the specific points because it is commonly accepted that if a certain book offends a number of certain persons, it should be placed on a reserved, restricted list for mature persons. The author establishes that the same principle can be applied to museums. Offensive statues can be kept in a separate from the general for the sake of the moralists and children, but that those of proper age should have the key to see it if they wish it. Those who appreciate the beauty of the art should not be impaired or inhibited in their enjoyment by those of the other view. The use of this analogy between the museums and libraries is explained so thoroughly that the reader has no choice but to agree that in the face of no other viable compromise, this is an ideal solution. Okay, why is this an example of a 3 as opposed to a 4? All right, I think that the blending of quotes works, but for the most part, it can become a little clunky at times, and sometimes there's a less clarity than there was in the example of a 4. There's less clarity. Also, the insight is limited. Look at the very end. At the very end is where we get the whole picture of what the writer is trying to prove here. The writer here, the student writer. But there is a lot of the writer does this, meaning from the student writer. This student writer says a lot of the writer, did this, and the writer did that, and the writer does this, and the writer does that. And they're all good, and then they distill all that information into one line. This is good. But the commentary, or rather the analysis, is uneven, right? You should not be waiting till the very end of your paragraph to give me the most analytical, the most powerful, poignant point of your analysis. I should be getting analysis all throughout. So this is an example of a 3 as opposed to a 4. And I think when you look at it side by side, you can understand what I mean. This one was a little more clear, a little more to the point, while this one had a lot of information, but there was some difficulty putting it together. Now here's the example of a 2. Now the example of a 2 again is only a little bit better than a 1. If you remember the 1, there was only quotes, then summarize the quote, then quote again, then summarize that quote again. So let's go to a 2. The point made by The Onion in the satirical press release by Magnus Holz is, with the right language, even the most nonsensical of things can begin to seem appealing, which is what advertisers do when they introduce non-causal correlation as fact. The Onion intends to illustrate to consumers how they are manipulated by manipulating the language of the marketers, using their own pseudoscience where advertisers would claim real science and marketing and making it abundantly clear that it is not meant to be taken seriously. Okay, I don't know if you noticed, but that was one whole sentence. It really wasn't. There was a few comma splices there, but the point is that it needs to be unpacked, right? The Onion also mocks the way marketers pander to consumers using multisyllabic scientific-sounding words with no meaning, such as reflexology and pteronometry, much in the way the articles that they are satirizing use to demonstrate how one cannot believe everything that is read because it is far easier to be convincing than to be right. The impression given is that if something is said with enough jargon and convincing, okay, I'm going to stop now. But I think you're understanding what's happening here. There is a lot of commentary, right? But it's commentary that is not attached to a moment in the text. And the way analysis works is, if you tell me that what happens in the text means this, then that immediately tells me that that's analysis. If done correctly, that's analysis, right? Analysis is when you tie your commentary or your inference to a moment in the text. This passage doesn't do that as much, this paragraph. It does use a lot of quotes, but only as to smooth out the sentence. But it's not really saying what happens here in this portion of the text means that. It's not doing that. So it has a lot of disembodied commentary. not attached to a portion of the text, which is why it makes it so that the evidence is not as specific, not as relevant. In the commentary, right, there is not an established line of reasoning necessarily, or it is faulty. This is why it gets a 2 as opposed to a 1. It is much higher. It is higher than a 1, I can tell you that, but it's not as good as a 3, right? Okay, so here are the examples of the 4. Hopefully you can understand now how to distribute the points for the evidence and commentary section of the exam. Here we go.